My son texted me, "Do not come to my wedding. My wife does not want to see you." I silently closed his bank accounts. The next day, they showed up at my doorstep, begging. If you are listening to this story right now, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a harsh truth about what happens when unconditional love is met with calculated cruelty. If you have ever felt entirely used by the people you sacrificed everything for, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me to know who is listening. It was a quiet Thursday evening in Chicago. The rain was beating steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my study, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and red. I sat in my leather armchair holding a glass of aged bourbon in one hand and a crisp, watermarked piece of paper in the other. It was a cashier's check for $150,000 made out to the Ritz-Carlton. This was the final payment for the grand ballroom, the imported orchids, the 5-course dinner, and the open bar for my son's wedding, scheduled for that coming Saturday. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades building a medical software empire from absolutely nothing. I did not inherit a fortune. I did not have wealthy connections. I started in a damp basement writing code until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. I built my company step by exhausting step to ensure that my family would never know the sting of poverty. When my beautiful wife Diane passed away 10 years ago, I poured every ounce of my remaining soul into our only child, Preston. Preston was 34 years old, serving as the vice president of sales at my company. I gave him the title, the 6-figure salary, and the keys to a $3 million penthouse on the Gold Coast. I gave him the world on a silver platter, hoping that my generosity would secure his future and honor his mother's memory. And Monica, his 30-year-old fiancée, always played the part of the sweet, fragile girl who just wanted to belong to a loving family. She would smile brightly every time I handed over my platinum card for her shopping trips down the Magnificent Mile. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, feeling the familiar warmth slide down my throat. I looked at the cashier's check again, feeling a quiet sense of pride. I was giving my son the wedding of his dreams. Then my phone buzzed on the heavy oak desk. The screen lit up in the dim room, casting a pale glow over the expensive mahogany wood. I reached over, expecting a last-minute question about the rehearsal dinner or a nervous text from a groom-to-be. Instead, I saw a message from Preston. It was brief. It was cold. It was exactly 15 words long. "Dad, do not come to the wedding tomorrow. Monica does not want to see you." I did not gasp. I did not drop my glass. I did not throw the phone across the room in a fit of rage. I simply sat there paralyzed in the absolute silence of my study, listening to the rain hit the glass. I read the message again, and then a third time. 15 words. 34 years of fatherhood, of sacrifices, of late nights and early mornings, all erased by 15 sterile words on a glowing screen. A strange numbness washed over my entire body. This was not a joke. This was not a typo. This was a direct, calculated eviction from my own son's life, delivered on the very eve of the event I was entirely financing. I thought about the check sitting on my desk. $150,000. That did not even include the $75,000 I had already paid the wedding planner, the custom designer dress Monica had cried over until I bought it, or the private jet I had booked for their honeymoon in Greece. I thought back to the early days of my medical software company. I remembered the years I spent sleeping on a cot in my office, surviving on cold coffee and sheer willpower. I developed diagnostic systems that revolutionized patient care, saving lives across the country. I built a legacy meant to stand the test of time. And while I was building that legacy, I tried to give Preston the childhood I never had. I attended his little league baseball games in my business suits. I helped him with his science projects late into the night. I paid for the best tutors, the elite summer camps, and the Ivy League tuition. I wanted him to be a man of character, a man who understood the value of hard work. But sitting in my quiet study listening to the relentless Chicago rain, I realized my greatest failure. I had given him wealth, but I had failed to give him worth. I had shielded him from struggle, and in return, he grew up without a spine. And Monica was the perfect parasite to attach to his weakness. She was a master manipulator, always speaking in a soft, breathy voice, playing the perpetual victim. She recognized Preston's entitlement and weaponized it against me. She knew exactly how to separate a son from his father, isolating him so she could control the assets. The text message was just the final brazen maneuver in a long game of psychological chess she had been playing for 3 years. The excuse was so poorly constructed, it was almost insulting. Monica claimed to suffer from severe social anxiety. She often used this invisible condition as a shield whenever she wanted to avoid a family gathering she found boring, or whenever she needed an excuse for her rude behavior. Yet this same crippling anxiety had magically disappeared last month, when she hosted a 50-person bachelorette party in Las Vegas, entirely funded by my secondary credit card. She had no problem commanding a VIP table at a crowded nightclub, but the mere thought of her future father-in-law attending her wedding was suddenly too much to bear. A deep, burning sensation began to replace the numbness in my chest. It was not just anger, it was a profound, devastating clarity. They did not fear me. They were not intimidated by my presence. They simply found me disposable. I was nothing more than an open wallet, a walking bank account that they tolerated only when they needed funding. They were perfectly happy to take my hundreds of thousands of dollars to throw a lavish party for their high society friends, but they found my actual physical presence to be an embarrassment. They wanted the fruits of my lifelong labor, but they wanted the laborer to remain completely invisible. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of an old man, now marked by age spots and years of relentless work. I looked at the phone again. I imagined Preston sitting in his luxury penthouse, holding his sleek device with soft, manicured fingers, casually typing away his father's presence. The juxtaposition was sickening. I placed the bourbon glass down on the desk. I picked up the cashier's check, staring at the bold numbers printed across the center. $150,000. I slowly folded the check in half, then in half again, and placed it inside my jacket pocket. If they wanted me to disappear, I would disappear. But I would not be leaving empty-handed. I would take every single ounce of my financial support with me into the shadows. They wanted to play a ruthless game, but they had completely forgotten who wrote the rules. I built an empire by surviving in a world of sharks and predators. I survived economic crashes and ruthless competitors. I knew how to cut my losses, and I knew exactly how to execute a hostile takeover. I reached for my phone. My hands were perfectly steady now. The grieving father had left the room, and the CEO had taken his place. I did not type a long emotional paragraph demanding an explanation. I did not call to beg for an invitation to my own son's wedding. I simply locked the screen and set the phone face down on the desk. Tomorrow the world, as they knew it, was going to completely collapse. But tonight, I had work to do. I picked up the phone I had just set down. The glass of bourbon remained untouched on the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. I stared at the dark screen, the 15 words still burning a hole in my mind. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to hear the exact tone my son would use to defend this incredible betrayal. I dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I pictured him in the penthouse, perhaps standing in the kitchen I paid for, looking at his screen with panic. Finally, on the 4th ring, the line clicked open. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was hushed, frantic, like a man hiding in a closet from a terrible storm. "Dad, I cannot talk loud right now," he continued. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping it of any emotion whatsoever. "Preston, I just read your message. I want you to explain it to me." A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. "Dad, please try to understand. This is not about you. It is about Monica. She is having a complete breakdown right now." I waited. I let the silence hang between us, forcing him to fill the void. She has severe social anxiety, Dad, he said, his tone shifting into a practiced plea for sympathy. You know how she gets. The wedding planning has been incredibly overwhelming for her. She is practically hyperventilating in the bedroom as we speak. I remained completely silent, staring out the window at the relentless Chicago rain. My son took my silence as an invitation to keep spinning his web. You are a very intense person, Dad, he said, his voice dropping an octave as if he were revealing a difficult truth. You have this commanding presence. You are a CEO who is used to running an empire, and when you are in a room, everyone feels the pressure to be perfect. Monica feels that pressure tenfold. She feels like she can never measure up to your standards. Having you sitting in the front row watching her every move, it is just too much for her mental health right now. She cannot handle pressure. Her therapist advised her to eliminate any major stressors for the weekend so she can actually enjoy the ceremony, he added. Stressors. I was a stressor. The man who had written a check for her imported orchids, her designer gown, and her 5-course dinner was now being classified as a medical hazard. I closed my eyes, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I never once raised my voice at Monica. I had never criticized her choices. I had only ever offered a blank check and a welcoming smile. Yet here was my son weaponizing modern therapy buzzwords to justify an unthinkable cruelty against the father who gave him absolutely everything. We love you, Dad. Of course we do. Preston continued, his tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my blood run cold. We just need space for this one weekend. It is her special day, and I have to put my future wife's mental health first. You taught me to take care of my family, right? That is all I am doing. I am protecting Monica. Please do not make this harder than it already is. Just stay home tomorrow. We can have a nice quiet dinner together after we get back from Greece. I promise. He was using my own lessons against me. The values of protection and family loyalty that I had instilled in him were weaponized. Those values were now being twisted into a convenient shield for his fiancée's malice. The urge to scream was primal. I wanted to tear the phone apart. I wanted to demand back every dollar I had poured into his ungrateful existence over the last 34 years. I wanted to remind him that the very roof over his head was mine. I wanted to tell him that his luxury car, his tailored suits, and his entire privileged life were funded by the sweat of my brow. But a screaming man is a weak man. A screaming man shows his hand, and a seasoned CEO never reveals his strategy before the contract is officially severed. I took a deep, steady breath. I swallowed the thick, sharp lump of betrayal lodged in my throat. I smoothed my voice into a calm, steady rhythm, ensuring that not a single tremor of anger bled through the speaker. I understand, Preston, I said quietly. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a massive, rushing sigh of relief. You do? He asked, sounding almost giddy, as if he could not believe how easily I had capitulated. Yes, I replied, my tone entirely devoid of any warmth or affection. Have a good day. I ended the call before he could utter another syllable. I placed the phone back down on the desk, the soft click echoing in the vast, empty study. He thought he had won. I could almost picture the smug smile spreading across Monica's face as Preston walked back into their lavish bedroom to announce that the old man had obediently rolled over. They thought I was a tired, compliant bank account who would fade into the background. They believed their carefully constructed lie had worked flawlessly. They were convinced I would sit in my empty house nursing my hurt feelings while they danced the night away on my dime. They thought they had successfully managed the situation without facing a single consequence for their atrocious behavior. They assumed my love for my son would blind me to the glaring inconsistencies in their ridiculous story. But they were wrong. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I built my life by reading people, by finding the hidden flaws in their pitches, and by dismantling their weak narratives. They forgot that a man who builds an empire from nothing does not simply surrender his dignity because of a polite request. As I looked at the dark screen of my phone, the initial shock completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound and dangerous clarity. I was no longer a grieving father trying to understand his son. I was an executive evaluating a bad investment, and it was time to liquidate. The excuse of social anxiety was a fragile facade, a cheap coat of paint over a crumbling foundation of lies. If Monica suffered from crippling social anxiety, she would not have demanded a grand ballroom reception with 300 guests. She would not have insisted on a towering wedding cake and a live jazz band. The narrative simply did not hold up to basic scrutiny. They were hiding something else, something much larger than a bride's fragile nerves. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the large window, watching the rain wash over the city below. My son had drawn the battle lines using deceit and manipulation. I would fight back using the only language they truly respected. It was time to show them the real world. I stepped away from the window and returned to my desk, sitting heavily in the leather chair. The silence of the study was absolute save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. I let Preston's excuse echo in my mind. Social anxiety, severe panic attacks, a fragile mental state triggered by the overwhelming presence of a demanding father. In the business world, when a pitch sounds too emotional, too desperate, it usually means the underlying numbers are completely fraudulent. You learn to strip away the dramatic narrative and look strictly at the data. And the data regarding Monica simply did not align with the terrified victim my son had just described. My razor-sharp business instincts, honed over 40 years of navigating corporate deception, began to slice through the polished veneer of their story. If Monica was truly paralyzed by social anxiety, if the mere thought of a crowd sent her into a spiraling panic, how did one explain her bachelorette party just last month? I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out my recent credit card statements. I flipped to the previous month, scanning the long columns of charges applied to the secondary platinum card I had entrusted to my son. There it was printed in bold black ink. A lavish 4-day excursion in Las Vegas. Monica had hosted 50 women, none of whom she seemed particularly anxious around, in a sprawling multi-room suite at the Bellagio. She had rented out private cabanas at exclusive day clubs, booked VIP tables at crowded nightclubs, and covered the tab for endless bottles of expensive champagne. She had stood in the center of packed, screaming crowds, reveling in the attention, bathing in the spotlight. The total bill had come to a staggering $22,000, all of it seamlessly charged to my account, without a single whisper of a panic attack. A woman terrified of public judgment does not fly 50 people across the country for a weekend of highly publicized alcohol-fueled excess. The contradiction was glaring. It was an insult to my intelligence to expect me to believe that a woman who thrived as the center of attention in Las Vegas would suddenly crumble at the prospect of her future father-in-law attending her wedding reception. The sheer absurdity of the premise was an affront to logic. I leaned back and interlaced my fingers, staring at the darkened sky outside. To think that I, the man who had bankrolled her extravagant lifestyle since the very first day Preston brought her home, was suddenly the sole trigger of her emotional instability. It was a poorly written script hastily thrown together to cover a much darker narrative. I refused to let my grief over Preston's cruelty cloud my judgment any further. I had spent decades sitting across negotiation tables, staring down corporate raiders and ambitious executives who thought they could outmaneuver me with fabricated sob stories. I knew the scent of a poorly concealed lie, and this entire situation reeked of desperation and hidden agendas. The lie was so glaringly obvious that it triggered a cascade of secondary realizations. My mind began to race, pulling up recent memories and isolated incidents that I had previously dismissed as harmless. I thought about Preston's behavior at the office over the past 3 months. He had always been eager to prove himself, but his ambition had recently taken a strange, urgent turn. He had been relentlessly pushing my chief technology officer for higher administrative clearances. He claimed he needed deeper access to our proprietary source code to better pitch our upcoming flagship medical software to regional hospitals. I had initially viewed his initiative as a sign of maturity, a welcome indication that he was finally taking his role as vice president of sales seriously. But now, filtered through the lens of this massive deception, his urgent requests felt less like ambition and much more like corporate espionage. Why did a sales executive absolutely need direct access to the raw, uncompiled architecture of our most valuable intellectual property? The code was the lifeblood of my company, the culmination of 5 years of research and millions of dollars in development. Preston did not need to see the code to sell the software. He only needed the final product. Then another memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. 2 weeks ago, Monica had casually brought up the security system at their Gold Coast penthouse. The property was a $3 million asset held entirely within my corporate trust. She had complained that the building management was too intrusive and suggested that she and Preston should change the master security codes. She claimed it was just for their own peace of mind, a desire for a greater sense of privacy as they prepared to start their married life together. At the time, I had merely nodded, assuming it was a harmless request from a young bride wanting to feel more ownership over her space. But changing the master codes would effectively lock out the building management, and by extension, it would lock me out of my own property. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together with terrifying speed, Preston demanding access to the foundational architecture of my life's work. Monica maneuvering to secure physical control over a multi-million-dollar real estate asset. And now, the sudden absolute necessity of banning me from a guest list composed of 300 people, all funded by my own checkbook. The gut feeling hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was a cold, suffocating wave of realization that washed away any lingering traces of paternal denial. This was not a temporary emotional crisis. This was not a bride suffering from last-minute jitters. This was a highly organized, deeply calculated strategic exile. They were systematically building a wall between me and my assets. They were extracting every ounce of value they could carry while simultaneously ensuring I had zero visibility into their actual operations. The wedding was not a celebration of their union. It was a deadline. It was the culmination of whatever scheme they had been quietly assembling right under my nose. They did not uninvite me because my presence would cause Monica to panic. They uninvited me because my presence would expose whatever it was they were truly doing tomorrow. They wanted my money to flow seamlessly into their accounts, but they needed the source of that money to remain completely blind, deaf, and absent. I had raised a son who viewed my generosity not as a gift to be cherished, but as a weakness to be mercilessly exploited. The truth settled heavily in the quiet room, an undeniable fact that I could no longer ignore. I was funding my own execution. The realization was incredibly chilling, but it also brought a sudden, tremendous focus to my mind. I stood up, walked over to the bar cart, and poured out the expensive bourbon into the small brass sink. The time for quiet reflection had officially passed. I was going to dismantle their entire operation, brick by stolen brick, starting right now, without hesitation and completely on my terms. I stepped away from the window, leaving the view of the stormy Chicago skyline behind me. I walked back to the heavy mahogany desk, the leather of my chair creaking slightly as I sat down. The glass of discarded bourbon sat empty in the small brass sink across the room, a testament to the shift that had just occurred within me. I was no longer a heartbroken father trying to understand why his only child had cast him aside. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Caldwell Medical Solutions, and I was about to execute a severe financial restructuring. I opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale light over the documents scattered across my desk. There would be no frantic phone calls tonight. There would be no emotional ultimatums or tearful demands for respect. In the corporate world, you do not warn a parasite before you sever its life support. You simply cut the line and watch it wither. I rested my fingers on the keyboard, taking one final, measured breath before I began the systematic dismantling of his privileged existence. I opened my encrypted browser and navigated straight to my primary wealth management portal. The authentication process took only a few moments, requiring a secure passcode and a biometric scan. Once logged in, the dashboard displayed the vast accumulated wealth of 4 decades of relentless work. I clicked on the tab labeled Caldwell Family Trust. This was the financial reservoir I had established shortly after my wife Diane had passed away. It was designed to ensure that Preston would never have to worry about a mortgage, a medical emergency, or his future children's college tuitions. It was a safety net woven from my own blood and sweat. I selected his profile. He was listed as a primary beneficiary with unrestricted withdrawal privileges up to a massive monthly limit. I stared at his name on the screen. I thought about the thousands of dollars he drained from this account every single month to maintain his illusion of being an independent success. He used my money to buy the bespoke suits he wore to the office, to pay for the extravagant dinners at exclusive downtown restaurants, and to fund the luxurious vacations that he and Monica constantly posted on social media. They lived like royalty on a treasury they had absolutely no part in building. I moved the cursor to the administrative control panel. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I altered his status. I changed his access level from active beneficiary to suspended. I revoked his withdrawal privileges completely. The system prompted me with a warning asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to freeze the beneficiary disbursements. I clicked confirm without a single tremor of hesitation. The screen refreshed, and his access to the family fortune was instantly eradicated. The financial umbilical cord was officially severed. Next, I navigated to the personal banking section. I pulled up the account for the secondary platinum credit card. This was the exact card Monica had so joyfully exhausted during her Las Vegas bachelorette party, the very card that had funded her designer wardrobe and her endless luxury spa treatments. I looked at the pending transactions for the last 48 hours. There were charges for champagne deliveries, expensive car detailing, and an exorbitant bill from a boutique bridal salon. They were spending my money at a staggering rate, completely confident that the well would never run dry. They assumed the old man would simply pay the statement at the end of the month, just as he always did, quietly, and without a single complaint. I found the security tab and selected the option to report the card as compromised. I initiated a total freeze on the account, ensuring that any future authorization attempts would be immediately and permanently declined. The banking system processed the requested block in less than 3 seconds. Monica's limitless shopping spree had just come to a violent, crashing halt. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction settling into my bones. The profound silence of the study contrasted sharply with the massive financial shockwaves I was silently sending out into the digital ether. There was no shouting match, no slammed doors, no dramatic confrontation. I was dismantling their world with the quiet, deadly precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. But I was not finished. Preston was not just my son. He was the vice president of sales at my company. And as an executive, he held a top-tier corporate expense account. I opened a new tab and logged into the corporate financial mainframe. I pulled up his employee profile. His corporate card was intended for taking prominent clients to dinner, booking travel for legitimate business conferences, and covering necessary operational expenses. However, over the past few months, the lines between his personal luxury and corporate necessity had become increasingly blurred. I had turned a blind eye to the excessive dinner tabs and the premium flight upgrades, writing them off as the standard perks of his high position. I would turn a blind eye no longer. I accessed the corporate spending controls and disabled his executive credit line entirely. I reduced his daily spending limit from $50,000 to exactly zero. I added a strict administrative block that would require my personal, written authorization for any future expense, no matter how small the amount might be. I watched the system acknowledge the update with a glowing green icon. The corporate treasury was now completely sealed off from his reach. Preston could not even buy a cup of coffee on the company dime anymore. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the digital trail of my actions. In less than 30 minutes, I had systematically dismantled the financial foundation of Preston and Monica's entire existence. I had stripped away the trust fund, frozen the personal credit lines, and locked down the corporate accounts. The quiet guillotine had fallen, and they were completely oblivious. Right now, they were likely sitting in their luxury penthouse congratulating themselves on successfully maneuvering the old man out of their perfect wedding weekend. They truly believed they had outsmarted me. They believed their future was bright, secure, and entirely funded by my lifelong labor. They had absolutely no idea that when the sun rose tomorrow, their shiny platinum cards would be useless plastic. They had no idea that their massive financial safety net had just evaporated into thin air. I closed my laptop, the screen going black, plunging the large desk into deep shadows. The rain continued to fall heavily outside, a relentless downpour, washing the city streets clean. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over my tired mind. The grieving process was officially over. The retaliation had begun. Tomorrow morning, I would deal with the luxury hotel and the wedding planner directly. I would make absolutely sure the $150,000 check was legally and permanently canceled. But for tonight, the first phase of their reality check was perfectly complete. I stood up from my heavy desk, leaving the dark, quiet study behind me, feeling entirely ready for the new dawn. I woke up on Friday morning before the sun even crested the Chicago skyline. The heavy rain from the previous night had passed, leaving behind a crisp, sharp chill in the air. I did not feel the exhaustion that usually accompanies a sleepless night of profound betrayal. Instead, I felt a massive surge of cold, focused energy coursing through my veins. I went through my morning routine with absolute mechanical precision. I showered, shaved, and put on a tailored charcoal suit, adjusting my silk tie in the mirror with perfectly steady hands. I looked at the man reflecting back at me. He was not the heartbroken father who had received a cruel text message just 12 hours ago. He was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar enterprise fully prepared to execute a hostile termination. I walked back into my quiet study. The folded cashier's check for $150,000 was exactly where I had left it, resting securely inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket. It was a simple piece of paper that represented a monumental lie. It was meant to fund a fairy tale that did not actually exist. I patted the pocket, ensuring the check was safe, and headed down to the garage. The drive into the financial district was quiet and uninterrupted. The city was just beginning to wake up, the streets filled with delivery trucks and early commuters. I pulled my car into the private underground parking garage of my primary bank. As a high-net-worth client, I entirely bypassed the standard teller lines and took the private elevator directly to the executive wealth management floor. I was greeted by my personal banker, a sharp, meticulous man named David, who had managed my accounts for over a decade. He looked slightly surprised to see me without an appointment, but he immediately ushered me into his glass-walled office. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the folded cashier's check, and placed it flat on the polished mahogany table between us. I told him I needed to cancel the instrument immediately and have the funds routed back into my primary holding account without any delays. David frowned, carefully examining the check. He noted that stopping a cashier's check was a highly unusual and slightly complicated procedure, especially one drawn for such a massive amount just days before the scheduled event. He reminded me of the strict banking protocols surrounding guaranteed funds. I leaned forward and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him the event had been fundamentally compromised, and my financial backing was entirely withdrawn as of this exact second. I instructed him to place a hard stop on the funds, sign the necessary affidavits for a canceled instrument, and flag the transaction as null and void. David saw the absolute finality in my expression. He did not ask any further questions about the wedding or my family dynamics. He simply nodded, logged into his secure terminal, and began processing the cancellation paperwork. I sat in the leather guest chair, silently watching his fingers move rapidly across the keyboard. Every single keystroke was another nail in the coffin of my son's grand deception. Within 15 minutes, the extensive paperwork was printed, signed, and officially filed into the system. The $150,000 was safely back in my possession. The hotel was no longer guaranteed a single cent of my money, and my son's lavish celebration was completely unfunded. I left the bank and walked back to my car, feeling a significant weight lift from my shoulders. But the financial extraction was only half complete. I needed to formally remove my name from the massive liability of the venue. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine still off, and pulled out my smartphone. I navigated to my contacts and found the direct number for the senior event director at the Ritz-Carlton, a highly efficient woman named Sarah, who had been coordinating the lavish details of the reception for the past 6 months. I pressed call and waited patiently as it rang. Sarah answered with her usual bright professional enthusiasm, greeting me warmly and asking if I had any last-minute adjustments for the grand ballroom. Her cheerful tone was a stark contrast to the absolute financial destruction I was about to deliver to my own family. I kept my voice perfectly smooth and authoritative. I informed her that there was a major adjustment to the existing contract. I told her that effective immediately, I was completely withdrawing all my financial backing for the event. I instructed her that my platinum credit card currently on file was no longer authorized for any incidental charges, open bar tabs, or remaining vendor balances. Sarah fell completely silent for a very long moment. When she finally spoke, her polished professional composure heavily faltered. She nervously reminded me that the final balance was due today, and without my financial guarantee, the event simply could not proceed as planned. She desperately explained that the custom swan ice sculptures, the imported floral arrangements from Holland, and the premium seafood catering were already in motion. I listened to her rising panic without a single trace of sympathy. I calmly explained that the event was no longer my responsibility. I told her that the groom, Preston Caldwell, was now the sole party responsible for the entire remaining balance. I instructed her to contact him directly at his personal number and demand a completely new form of payment immediately. I made it absolutely clear that if she attempted to charge my accounts, my formidable legal team would violently intervene. I legally removed myself from the entire operation, wishing her the best of luck in collecting the massive funds from my son. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the passenger seat. The morning sun was now fully illuminating the vast Chicago skyline, reflecting brightly off the towering glass and steel structures. The trap was perfectly set. The luxurious safety nets were completely removed. Preston and Monica were about to wake up to a brutal reality they had never prepared for. They had demanded my absence, and I had happily obliged them in the most devastating way possible. I started the engine of my car, feeling a deep, profound, and quiet satisfaction. The financial hemorrhage had been successfully stopped, but the corporate investigation was just beginning. It was time to find out exactly what else my son had been hiding behind his arrogant, entitled smile. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the heavy morning traffic, steering my car toward the corporate headquarters. I needed to see what my head of security had uncovered during his late-night audit of Preston's computer. The 15-word text message had initiated a war, and I was going to ensure that I dictated the terms of every single battle. My son wanted to play a deceptive game of shadows, but he was about to face the blazing, unforgiving light of absolute truth. He would quickly learn that my forgiveness was never an option. I pulled my car into the executive parking garage of Caldwell Medical Solutions. The corporate headquarters stood as a towering monument to my life's work, a sleek glass structure situated in the bustling heart of Chicago. It was just past 8 in the morning, and the massive building was already humming with the quiet, focused energy of hundreds of brilliant minds. Today, however, my focus was not on our upcoming software launch or our quarterly earnings reports. My focus was singularly locked on the Vice President of Sales. Preston was officially out of the office on paid time off, presumably spending his Friday finalizing the extravagant details of a wedding reception that no longer existed. His absence provided the perfect operational window for a complete security sweep. I bypassed my usual corner office and walked directly to the restricted wing that housed our legal and information technology departments. Jonathan Reed, my corporate attorney, was already waiting for me in the glass-walled conference room. Jonathan was a man of few words and ruthless efficiency, a veteran lawyer who had navigated me through every major corporate battle of the last 2 decades. Beside him sat Victor, our head of IT security, a brilliant digital architect who managed the intricate firewalls protecting our medical diagnostic systems. I closed the heavy soundproof door and lowered the electronic privacy blinds, completely sealing us off from the rest of the executive floor. I did not offer a gentle introduction or exchange pleasantries. I looked directly at Victor and instructed him to initiate a full covert forensic audit of Preston Caldwell. Victor blinked his professional composure, briefly slipping in the face of such a drastic order. To audit an executive at the vice president level was a massive protocol breach under normal circumstances, let alone when that specific executive was the founder's only son. I clarified my directive, ensuring my voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth or hesitation. I told Victor that I wanted a complete extraction of every single byte of data associated with Preston. I wanted his corporate email archives, his deleted items, his private chat logs, and his cloud storage backups. I wanted his office desktop bypassed and mirrored, and I wanted his company-issued smartphone remotely cloned without triggering any user notifications. Jonathan leaned forward in his leather chair, carefully steepling his fingers. He asked if there was a specific intellectual property breach we were looking for, or if this was merely a precautionary measure. I replied that I was looking for the absolute truth, whatever ugly form it happened to take. I authorized them to bypass all of Preston's passwords and override his encryption keys immediately. Victor nodded, his fingers already flying across his secure tablet as he began dismantling the executive access protocols. He explained that since Preston was utilizing company hardware on our proprietary network, we had full legal authorization to mirror his drives without a warrant. Jonathan confirmed the legality of the maneuver, ensuring that everything we found would be perfectly admissible in a civil or criminal court. I sat at the head of the conference table, silently watching the digital progress bars slowly fill on the large presentation screen. The extraction process was meticulous and agonizingly slow. Bypassing the sophisticated layers of security Preston had erected around his personal folders required advanced decryption tools. As the minutes slowly turned into hours, I sat in the silent, heavily air-conditioned room, sipping bitter black coffee from a paper cup. I thought deeply about the sheer tragic irony of the situation unfolding before me. I had personally authorized Preston's high-level security clearances. I had handed him the literal keys to the corporate kingdom, trusting that his bloodline inherently guaranteed his loyalty. I had ignored the subtle arrogance in his leadership style, repeatedly writing it off as youthful confidence. I had paid him an exorbitant salary, desperately hoping it would satisfy his massive appetite for luxury and keep him focused on the company's mission. Instead, that immense privilege had clearly bred a profound toxic entitlement. He viewed the company not as a legacy to protect, but as a personal treasury to ruthlessly exploit. I watched Victor's screen as endless lines of code rapidly scrolled past in a blur of green and black. He was currently breaking through a hidden password-protected partition that Preston had deliberately buried deep within his local hard drive. Why would a sales executive need a shadow drive heavily encrypted against his own IT department? The answer was painfully obvious. You only hide things that you know will completely condemn you. My heart felt incredibly heavy, a dull ache radiating through my chest. Treating my own flesh and blood as a hostile corporate threat was a tragedy I had never emotionally prepared for. But the pain of a father had to be completely suppressed by the sworn duty of a chief executive. I had hundreds of loyal employees who depended entirely on the stability of this company to feed their families and pay their mortgages. I could not allow one entitled parasite to bring the entire ship down, even if that parasite carried my last name. Around noon, Victor let out a sharp, sudden exhale that shattered the heavy silence in the room. He stopped typing and stared intensely at his glowing monitor. He dragged a massive zip file onto the main presentation screen for Jonathan and me to see. The file was labeled with a generic numerical code, but its contents were absolutely staggering. Victor explained that Preston had systematically bypassed the standard corporate data retention policies over the last 8 consecutive months. He had successfully installed an illegal third-party application specifically designed to permanently scrub his email outbox and wipe his daily communication logs entirely clean. But Preston was just a salesman, not a network architect. He did not realize that our primary security servers automatically captured and quarantined unauthorized deletion requests in a secure, hidden vault. Victor had just recovered 6 months' worth of purged, highly sensitive communications. He opened the first digital folder, revealing thousands of encrypted emails and direct messages that Preston had desperately tried to erase from existence. Jonathan stood up quickly, adjusting his glasses as he approached the large screen. The sheer volume of hidden data was absolutely chilling to witness. It was a digital graveyard of secrets, an elaborate shadow operation running silently beneath the surface of my company. I told Victor to begin decrypting the email chains immediately. I needed to know exactly who Preston had been talking to while he was smiling at me across the boardroom table. As Victor initiated the final decryption sequence, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. It was another frantic call from the hotel event manager, desperately trying to locate a valid payment method for the custom swan ice sculptures and the imported floral arrangements. I silenced the device without a second thought and placed it face down on the table. The wedding crisis was completely irrelevant now. We were staring directly at a monumental corporate betrayal, and I was about to read the exact words my son had used to orchestrate my absolute financial downfall. The screen illuminated the dark conference room with a harsh, unforgiving light. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the decrypted text of the first email chain. It was an exchange between Preston and a notorious competitor in the medical software sector. The words on the screen detailed a highly sophisticated plan to systematically leak our proprietary algorithms in exchange for a massive, untraceable payout channeled through offshore shell companies. My own son was negotiating the quiet sale of my life's work. The sheer brazenness of his digital paper trail was breathtaking. He had meticulously outlined how he planned to use his access to siphon our client database, destabilize our upcoming software launch, and ultimately force a hostile buyout that would leave him incredibly wealthy and my company entirely bankrupt. I felt a cold, calculating rage crystallize within my chest. The emotional shock was gone, replaced by absolute clarity. Preston had crossed the line from an ungrateful child to an active corporate terrorist. And a corporate terrorist does not get to sleep comfortably in a multi-million-dollar sanctuary funded by his victim. I turned away from the glowing monitor and looked directly at Jonathan. I instructed him to immediately dispatch our senior legal associates and a bonded corporate locksmith to the Gold Coast. The penthouse they lived in was not theirs. It was a premium asset held exclusively by the Caldwell Medical Solutions Corporate Trust provided to Preston as a housing perk. Since he had utilized corporate resources to commit severe fraud, his employment was effectively suspended, pending the final results of the forensic audit, which meant his housing privileges were instantly revoked. I checked my watch. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. According to the original wedding itinerary that I had paid for, Preston and Monica were currently hosting their lavish rehearsal brunch at an upscale restaurant overlooking the river. They were likely surrounded by their bridal party, drinking expensive mimosas and laughing about how easily they had handled my absence. This provided us with the perfect operational window. I told Jonathan that I wanted that penthouse completely locked down before the brunch concluded. Jonathan pulled out his phone and began making the necessary calls, his voice low and sharp. Within 10 minutes, a specialized property recovery team was mobilized and navigating through the heavy Chicago traffic toward the Gold Coast. I remained in the secure conference room, listening to the real-time updates. The team arrived at the luxury building and presented the official corporate trust documentation. Because my company legally owned the property, the management was obligated to grant our locksmith unquestioned access. I visualized the team stepping out of the private elevator and approaching the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse. This was the same residence where Monica had confidently hosted lavish dinner parties on my dime, the same space she had arrogantly attempted to secure against me just 2 weeks prior. The corporate locksmith wasted no time. He completely dismantled the sophisticated electronic deadbolts and replaced them with heavy reinforced physical locks. He then accessed the central security panel hidden in the foyer and completely rewrote the digital master codes, wiping Preston and Monica's biometric data from the entire system. The physical sanctuary they had built their arrogant kingdom upon was now totally impenetrable. I sat quietly sipping my cold coffee, feeling a profound sense of justice in this swift, merciless action. I was taking back the ground I had freely given. While the locksmith secured the perimeter, Jonathan's legal associates were executing the next phase. They drafted a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. The document explicitly stated that due to a pending corporate investigation regarding severe intellectual property theft, the residents' occupancy rights were immediately terminated. Jonathan read the terms of the notice aloud to me over the speakerphone, ensuring every single legal requirement was perfectly met. The document was cold, incredibly sterile, and utterly devastating. It stripped away all familial ties and treated Preston exactly as he had chosen to act, like a rogue employee. The legal team securely taped the eviction notice directly to the center of the newly installed front doors. They took date-stamped photographs of the posted document to ensure there could be absolutely no legal disputes. The team then performed a rapid, highly structured sweep of the interior space. They did not touch any of Preston or Monica's personal belongings, their designer clothes, or their expensive jewelry. They merely verified that no sensitive corporate hardware was left unattended in the residence. Once the brief visual sweep was concluded, the team exited the penthouse, sealing the heavy doors behind them with a definitive, echoing click. The multi-million-dollar apartment was now a locked, inaccessible vault. Jonathan ended the call and placed his phone on the table, nodding at me to confirm the operation was a complete success. I looked back at the large presentation screen where Victor was continuing to pull more damning evidence from the shadow drive. We had successfully frozen their financial assets in the dead of night, canceled the massive wedding reception, and now we had physically locked them out of their own home. The magnitude of the retaliation was perfectly matched to the severity of their betrayal. I imagined the exact moment they would return from their joyous rehearsal brunch. They would ride the private elevator up to the 34th floor, completely exhausted from celebrating themselves. They would reach for the door handle, expecting the smooth, welcoming chime of their biometric scanners. Instead, they would be met with cold, unyielding metal and a harsh legal document. They would realize with a sudden, suffocating panic that the invisible shield protecting their extravagant lifestyle had been completely shattered. The narrative of the frail, demanding father causing social anxiety was officially dead. The reality of a ruthless chief executive defending his empire had fully arrived. I felt no guilt, no lingering paternal remorse. My son had fundamentally broken the social and moral contract of our family the moment he decided to sell my company. He had actively chosen greed over loyalty, and now he was going to experience the devastating consequences of living without my protection. I turned my attention back to Victor, asking him to compile a dossier of every fraudulent email and encrypted transaction. We needed to prepare a massive, legally bulletproof package for the authorities. The eviction notice was merely a temporary measure, a 30-day warning that would ultimately lead to a permanent, unceremonious removal. But the corporate evidence we were currently gathering would lead to something far more severe. It would lead to criminal prosecution. I sat in the secure, heavily air-conditioned room, breathing in the sterile air, knowing that the storm I had unleashed was about to crash down upon them with unimaginable force. The financial guillotine had fallen silently, and the physical doors were securely locked. Now it was time to let the overwhelming weight of their own incredibly destructive actions completely crush their arrogant spirits. The war they secretly started was now entirely mine to finish, and I would leave them with absolutely nothing. I was taking everything back today, starting right now. I remained in the secure conference room as the afternoon stretched on the hum of the air conditioning, providing a steady background to the digital excavation happening on Victor's screen. The clock on the wall crept past 3 in the afternoon, marking the exact time Preston and Monica were likely wrapping up their lavish rehearsal brunch, oblivious to the storm gathering above them. The heavy soundproof door clicked open, and Jonathan Reed walked in. My corporate attorney did not possess his usual calm demeanor. His face was drawn tight, his jaw set in a rigid line that immediately told me the situation was far worse than we had anticipated. He held a thick, bound folder in his hands, the kind we typically used for massive litigation files. He walked directly to the head of the mahogany table and placed the heavy stack of papers squarely in front of me. He did not sit down. He simply stood there, resting his hands on the back of a leather chair, and took a slow, measured breath. He told me that Victor and his team had successfully bypassed the final layer of Preston's shadow drive encryption. They had recovered over 400 individual email threads, private messages, and cloud documents that my son had desperately attempted to permanently delete. Jonathan advised me to brace myself. He warned me that what I was about to read went far beyond standard corporate espionage or financial embezzlement. He said it was deeply personal, incredibly malicious, and meticulously planned over the last 14 months. I looked down at the blank cover of the folder. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I did not hesitate. I opened the cover and began to read the first page. The top document was a printed email chain dated 6 months prior. The sender was Preston, using a highly secure encrypted mail account. The recipients were 3 senior partners at a notoriously aggressive venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley, a firm famous for hostile takeovers and stripping legacy companies down to their bare assets. The subject line simply read, "Project Caldwell Transition." I read the words my son had typed, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face. Preston was explicitly outlining a strategy to systematically devalue my company from the inside out. He had provided these corporate vultures with highly confidential projections, internal structural weaknesses, and a detailed map of our proprietary medical algorithms. He was offering them the keys to my entire empire on a silver platter. In exchange, the venture capitalists were guaranteeing Preston a massive, untraceable payout of $12 million, deposited directly into a series of offshore shell companies, completely bypassing American tax and legal jurisdictions. They were negotiating the sale of my life's work as if they were haggling over a used vehicle. But the financial betrayal, as staggering as it was, paled in comparison to the sheer, unadulterated cruelty embedded in the text. I turned the page, moving deeper into the chronological record of their conspiracy. The next set of documents consisted of recovered private chat logs between Preston and his supposed loving fiancée, Monica. Monica was not merely a passive beneficiary of my son's grand deception. She was the primary architect of his daily manipulation. The messages laid her true nature bare in cold, glowing text. She wrote with a clinical, sociopathic detachment that made my skin crawl. In a message dated just 3 weeks ago, she had specifically instructed Preston on how to handle my inquiries regarding the software development cycle. She told him to keep feeding the old man minor, insignificant details to make him feel like he was still in charge. I read a subsequent message where Preston complained about my persistent questions regarding his sales reports. Monica's response was a masterclass in calculated malice. She told him to be patient, reminding him that the wedding weekend was the perfect final distraction. She explicitly referred to me as an obsolete cash cow. She typed those exact words. She said I was a tired, obsolete cash cow who just needed to be kept completely blind and perfectly content until the final venture capital contracts were signed on Monday morning. They had deliberately manufactured the story of her crippling social anxiety. They had orchestrated the massive fight about the wedding guest list for one singular purpose. They needed me completely isolated, entirely distracted by family drama, and physically away from the corporate headquarters during the final critical 48 hours of their massive financial coup. I sat perfectly still, the thick stack of papers feeling heavy and toxic in my hands. The narrative they had spun yesterday in my study, the tearful pleas for space, the weaponization of therapy buzzwords, it had all been a brilliantly executed theatrical performance. They had looked me in the eye and played upon my paternal love, my desire to protect my family, and my willingness to accommodate a fragile bride. They had weaponized my own decency against me. I read another email from Preston to the lead venture capitalist confirming that the Gold Coast penthouse had been completely secured under Monica's name, or at least that is what he foolishly believed. He assured the investors that he would have complete administrative control over the company servers by Sunday evening, while I was supposedly sitting at home nursing my hurt feelings over being banished from his lavish wedding reception. The sheer audacity of his plan was breathtaking. He intended to gut my legacy, steal my assets, and leave me holding an empty shell of a corporation by the time I walked back into this building on Monday. I looked up from the documents. Jonathan was still standing there watching me with a quiet, respectful silence. He had seen many executives face devastating corporate losses, but watching a father read the documented malicious betrayal of his only child was a different kind of tragedy. He softly asked me how I wanted to proceed. He informed me that we had more than enough actionable evidence to immediately involve federal authorities. We could have the FBI waiting at their penthouse door by this evening. The wire fraud, the intellectual property theft, and the conspiracy to commit corporate espionage carried sentences that would easily put both Preston and Monica behind bars for decades. I looked at the phrase, obsolete cash cow. The words burned themselves into my memory, searing away the last fragile threads of my paternal hesitation. A father might hesitate to send his son to federal prison. A father might try to find a way to quietly resolve the issue, to seek counseling, to salvage the shredded remains of their relationship. But the father was completely dead. Preston and Monica had violently murdered him the moment they decided to treat his lifelong sacrifices as a weakness to be exploited. Only the chief executive officer remained in this chair, and a chief executive officer does not offer quiet resolutions to corporate terrorists. I closed the folder and pushed it across the polished mahogany table. I looked at Jonathan, my voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of any grief. I told him to contact the federal prosecutor immediately. Jonathan nodded curtly, recognizing the absolute finality in my command. He pulled his phone from his breast pocket and stepped into the soundproof glass vestibule to make the call that would initiate a federal criminal investigation into my only son. I remained seated at the heavy mahogany table, my eyes locked on the large presentation screen. Victor had not stopped working. While Jonathan was securing the legal mechanisms of our retaliation, our Chief of Information Technology Security was digging even deeper into the digital graveyard of Preston's encrypted shadow drive. Victor's fingers moved across his keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. The sudden silence in the conference room was broken only by the sharp, repetitive clicking of his keystrokes. He was running a deep packet inspection on the massive data transfers that had occurred over the company network during the past 3 whole days. Victor paused, his eyes narrowing as he traced a complex routing path on his monitor. He turned his laptop screen slightly toward me, his expression grave. He had isolated a highly sophisticated series of encrypted file transfers that Preston had executed late last Tuesday night. My son had waited until the corporate headquarters was entirely empty before initiating a massive download from our primary secure development servers. I watched the data logs scroll past, feeling a cold, heavy dread settling into my stomach. Preston had not just been downloading sales reports or client lists. He had systematically accessed the highly restricted partitioned servers that housed the core architectural frameworks of our upcoming flagship medical diagnostic software. This was the exact proprietary source code that represented 5 years of relentless research, millions of dollars in venture capital funding, and the entire future of Caldwell Medical Solutions. My mind flashed back to the seemingly innocent conversations we had shared in my office just a few weeks prior. Preston had been demanding higher administrative clearances, claiming he needed to understand the underlying mechanics of the software to better pitch it to major regional hospital networks. I had praised his initiative. I had authorized the security bypass, entirely believing I was fostering his growth as an executive leader. Instead, I had personally handed him the digital keys to the company vault. Victor traced the destination of the stolen files. Preston had routed the massive data packets through a series of anonymous, decentralized proxy servers, a desperate attempt to wash the digital fingerprints from the theft. But he had fundamentally underestimated the tracking capabilities built into the core architecture of our software. Every single line of code contained a hidden microscopic digital watermark that Victor was currently tracking across the globe. The trail ended abruptly at a secure private cloud storage server leased by a corporate entity I had never heard of before. Victor pulled up the registration data for the server account. The holding company was a newly minted limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware is notoriously famous for offering corporate anonymity, allowing business owners to shield their true identities behind walls of impenetrable administrative bureaucracy. However, the legal shielding was utterly useless against a forensic audit that had already breached the primary user's local network. Victor cross-referenced the billing information tied to the cloud storage account with the financial records he had just extracted from Preston's deleted emails. The match was instantaneous and absolutely undeniable. The Delaware entity was named Apex Medical Innovations. The primary registered agent was Preston Caldwell. The chief operating officer was listed as Monica Sterling. They had not just stolen the proprietary source code of my flagship software. They had secretly built an entire corporate infrastructure specifically designed to receive the stolen intellectual property, rebrand it, and launch it into the market as their own revolutionary product. The audacity of the scheme was utterly breathtaking. They were planning to take the monumental medical breakthrough that my brilliant team of engineers had spent half a decade developing and simply slap a new logo on the interface. They intended to steal the future of my company and use it to build their own independent empire completely built on the ashes of my life's work. Victor opened another folder of recovered documents, revealing the detailed business plan that Monica had drafted and circulated to the hostile venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. The document outlined a ruthless, highly coordinated market strategy. Apex Medical Innovations was scheduled to officially launch exactly 30 days after our own highly publicized release date. They planned to leverage the stolen source code to offer the exact same diagnostic capabilities at half the price, effectively undercutting our market share and driving Caldwell Medical Solutions into immediate catastrophic bankruptcy. Monica's strategy document coldly calculated the exact financial impact their rival launch would have on my company, predicting total operational insolvency within 6 months. They were not just stealing my assets. They were actively orchestrating the complete and total annihilation of the legacy I had spent 40 years building from the ground up. I stared at the glowing presentation screen, the sheer magnitude of their treachery threatening to consume me. This was the ultimate betrayal. This was a calculated, lethal strike aimed directly at the heart of everything I held dear. The elaborate lies about social anxiety, the dramatic fights over the wedding guest list, the frantic demands to banish me from the reception. It was all merely a smokescreen. They needed me completely distracted and physically separated from the corporate network during this exact weekend. They needed the 48 hours of the wedding celebration to finalize the digital transfer of the source code and complete the legal registration of their rival Delaware corporation. They truly believed they had executed the perfect corporate crime right under the nose of a clueless, obsolete father. Jonathan stepped back into the conference room, quietly closing the heavy glass door behind him. He informed me that the federal prosecutor had been successfully briefed and that a specialized unit of cybercrime investigators was currently being mobilized. I nodded, my vision locked on the digital evidence of my son's monumental failure of character. The deep, agonizing grief that had threatened to drown me just yesterday had completely evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity of purpose. I was going to systematically destroy the fraudulent empire they had tried to build. I was going to ensure that their Delaware corporation was legally dismantled before it ever saw the light of day. And I was going to make absolutely certain that the federal authorities had every single bite of evidence they needed to secure maximum sentences for corporate espionage and massive intellectual property theft. The quiet guillotine had fallen on their finances. The physical doors to their luxury penthouse had been permanently locked. Now it was time to let the massive, crushing weight of the federal justice system completely obliterate their future. They wanted to build a glorious kingdom entirely on the ashes of my hard work and lifelong dedication to the medical field. Instead, I would ensure that the only structure they inhabited for the next 20 years would be constructed of cold steel bars and reinforced concrete. The perfect trap was officially set today. I sat in the quiet conference room, the digital evidence of my son's treason burning brightly on the presentation screen. The sheer scale of the corporate espionage was staggering, but my mind suddenly pivoted back to the original catalyst of this entire nightmare: the wedding. Preston and Monica had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure I was physically absent from the reception. They had spun a pathetic web of lies about social anxiety and mental health, all to keep me away from a ballroom that I had personally rented for them. I turned away from the source code extraction and asked Victor to pull up the final wedding itinerary and the approved guest list. Since I had authorized the massive payments to the event planners, the complete administrative files were readily accessible through my personal email archives. Victor tapped a few keys, and a meticulously organized spreadsheet appeared on the large monitor. I leaned back in my leather chair, instructing him to magnify the names. I had not previously reviewed the list in detail. Like any trusting father, I had simply written the checks and allowed the young couple to manage their own celebration. I expected to see a long column of our extended relatives, Preston's college friends, Monica's family from out of state, and the usual assortment of childhood acquaintances. Instead, as my eyes scanned the 300 names, a new and deeply disturbing reality began to take shape. There were barely any family members listed. My sister and her husband were not on the list. Preston's cousins were conspicuously absent. Even Monica's own parents were relegated to a minor table near the back of the room. The people occupying the premium tables, the VIP seating arrangements, and the exclusive reserved lounges were completely foreign to our family tree. But their names were not foreign to me. I recognized them immediately. The list was a veritable directory of the most powerful and aggressive venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. I saw the names of the 3 senior partners from the exact investment firm that Preston had been illegally emailing. I saw managing directors from prominent private equity funds and aggressive acquisition firms. But the true horror set in when I scrolled down to the 3rd tier of the seating chart. My breathing slowed as I read the names of my own clients. Preston had invited the chief executive officers and head purchasing directors of every major regional hospital network that Caldwell Medical Solutions currently serviced. These were the exact same individuals I had spent 2 decades cultivating relationships with, the people whose trust formed the very foundation of my company's revenue stream. The puzzle pieces locked together with a resounding, deafening crash. The event scheduled for tomorrow afternoon was not a wedding reception. It was a covert corporate launch party for Apex Medical Innovations, completely disguised as a nuptial celebration. They were going to stand in front of my biggest clients and my most aggressive competitors, drinking champagne that I had paid for in a grand ballroom that I had rented, to announce a revolutionary new medical software that they had stolen directly from my private servers. They intended to use the joyous, relaxed atmosphere of a wedding to quietly pitch the stolen algorithms, secure early commitments from my existing client base, and finalize their $12 million payout from the venture capitalists. It was an investor summit masked by white lace and imported orchids. If I had attended the reception as originally planned, sitting proudly at the father of the groom table, I would have immediately recognized the corporate heavyweights in the room. I would have mingled with my own clients, asked questions, and unraveled their entire hostile takeover in a matter of minutes. That is precisely why my presence was an absolute non-negotiable threat to their operation. Monica did not have social anxiety. She had the cold, calculating nerves of a corporate assassin. They needed me completely isolated, sitting alone in my dark study, nursing my wounded paternal pride, while they actively slaughtered my company's future on the dance floor. The sheer staggering audacity of the plan was almost impressive in its absolute ruthlessness. They were using my own money to fund my professional execution. I stood up from the conference table, the physical space of the room suddenly feeling too small to contain the immense cold fury expanding within my chest. I walked toward the window, looking out over the bustling streets of the financial district. I had spent 40 years building an empire based on trust, innovation, and relentless hard work. I had sacrificed countless weekends, missed family dinners, and poured my soul into creating a legacy that would outlast me. And my son had decided to sell it all for a quick payout and the illusion of independent success. He had reduced our entire relationship to a mere stepping stone for his own greed. I turned back to Jonathan, my corporate attorney, who was staring at the guest list with an expression of quiet disgust. I told him that we were no longer simply playing defense. We were transitioning into an aggressive, scorched earth offensive. I instructed Jonathan to immediately draft a comprehensive series of cease and desist orders, targeting every single venture capitalist and private equity firm listed on that spreadsheet. I wanted them legally warned that any business conducted with Preston Caldwell or Apex Medical Innovations would constitute the knowing reception of stolen intellectual property. We would threaten them with massive catastrophic litigation that would tie up their funds in federal court for a decade. I then turned to Victor. I ordered him to prepare a secure encrypted data package containing the absolute proof of Preston's theft, the recovered emails, the forged cloud server registrations, and the exact digital routing path of the stolen source code. We were going to prepare a dossier so legally devastating that no investor in their right mind would ever dare to touch my son's fraudulent company. Tomorrow was supposed to be the most important day of Preston's life. He had planned to step into the spotlight, surrounded by wealthy investors and stolen clients, believing he had successfully outmaneuvered the old man. He thought he was untouchable. He genuinely believed his elaborate deception was entirely flawless. But the quiet guillotine had already fallen. His trust fund was entirely empty. His corporate credit cards were instantly declined. The locks on his luxurious penthouse had been physically replaced, and the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton was completely canceled. He was currently standing over a massive trapdoor, completely unaware that I held the heavy iron lever securely in my hand. I told Jonathan and Victor that we would aggressively assemble the final legal packages tonight, without any delays. We would ensure that every single document was perfectly prepared for the federal prosecutors. I felt a profound, chilling calmness settle deeply into my weary bones. Tomorrow we would not just confront my arrogant son. We would completely and utterly dismantle his fabricated world in broad daylight, leaving him absolutely nothing but the terrible consequences of his own boundless greed. This ends the deception. The absolute truth was finally right here. This ends the deception. The absolute truth was finally right here. I sat in the conference room staring at the digital projection on the wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that had just crystallized before my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening clarity, forming a picture so ruthless that it temporarily robbed me of my breath. The lavish event scheduled for tomorrow afternoon was never going to be a celebration of love. The $150,000 cashier's check I had willingly handed over was not meant to pay for imported floral arrangements, a live jazz band, or a towering wedding cake. It was a perfectly disguised Trojan horse. Preston and Monica had brazenly used my paternal generosity to fund a massive high-stakes corporate launch party for their stolen startup. The entire wedding narrative was nothing more than a brilliant, malicious smokescreen designed to funnel my money directly into their illicit enterprise. In the corporate world, launching a rival tech company requires immense upfront capital. You need to rent an exclusive venue, cater premium food and beverages, and create an atmosphere of absolute luxury to woo high-level investors and key decision-makers. By framing this critical corporate event as a lavish wedding reception, Preston had bypassed every single financial hurdle. He had manipulated me into underwriting the entirety of his startup costs without raising a single red flag. Who audits a wedding budget for corporate espionage? Who questions a father paying for his only son's big day? They had flawlessly weaponized my love to bankroll my own corporate assassination. The sheer audacity of the scheme was both terrifying and infuriating. They were planning to stand in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, surrounded by the absolute elite of the medical software industry, and toast to their new partnership. But the partnership they were celebrating was not a marriage. It was the birth of Apex Medical Innovations. I closed my eyes and vividly pictured how tomorrow evening was supposed to unfold. I imagined the massive ballroom bathed in warm, elegant lighting, filled with 300 guests dressed in formal attire. I visualized Preston taking the stage, tapping his champagne glass to command the attention of the room. The crowd would quiet down, expecting a heartfelt speech about his beautiful new bride. Instead, the lights would dim, and a massive projection screen would lower from the ceiling. Preston would smoothly pivot from the role of a grateful groom to the dynamic chief executive officer of a revolutionary new tech company. He would proudly unveil the stolen diagnostic software, demonstrating the lightning-fast algorithms and the seamless user interface that my brilliant team of engineers had spent 5 grueling years developing. He would stand under the spotlight, presenting my life's work as his own brilliant creation, and the audience would eagerly applaud. I looked back at the guest list glowing on Victor's monitor, the names of my biggest clients and my most aggressive competitors staring back at me. Preston had invited the chief executive officers of the major regional hospital networks, the very people whose contracts kept Caldwell Medical Solutions operational. He was going to use the joyous, relaxed atmosphere of a fake wedding reception to quietly pitch the stolen software, offering them the exact same medical diagnostic capabilities at a fraction of the cost. He would use the momentum of the evening to secure early commitments, effectively stealing my entire client base in a single night. The Silicon Valley venture capitalists sitting at the premium VIP tables would witness the overwhelming market interest firsthand. They would see my clients eagerly signing letters of intent, and they would instantly validate the $12 million payout Preston had negotiated. The entire operation was designed to bleed my company dry before Monday morning. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train, completely obliterating the last remaining fragments of the pathetic lie they had told me. This was the exact, undeniable reason why my presence at the reception was an absolute non-negotiable threat to their entire operation. Monica did not suffer from crippling social anxiety. She was not terrified of my commanding presence or my high expectations. She was terrified of my eyes. She was terrified of my corporate knowledge. If I had walked into that grand ballroom tomorrow afternoon, I would not have seen a standard gathering of distant relatives and college friends. I would have instantly recognized the heavy hitters of the medical software industry. I would have seen the faces of my own clients sitting at the tables I had paid for. I would have heard the distinct proprietary terminology of my own algorithms being pitched from the stage. My mere presence would have detonated their entire fraudulent empire before the first course of the premium seafood dinner was even served. I would have stopped the presentation, confronted the venture capitalists, and called the federal authorities right there in the middle of the ballroom. Preston and Monica knew that the absolute success of their hostile takeover depended entirely on my complete physical absence and my total ignorance. They needed me sitting alone in my dark study, nursing my wounded paternal pride, feeling guilty for supposedly triggering my future daughter-in-law's panic attacks. They had meticulously engineered a family drama to keep me perfectly isolated while they actively slaughtered my company on the dance floor. The level of sociopathic calculation required to execute such a maneuver was staggering. I stood up from the conference table and walked slowly toward the glass wall, looking out at the city below. The streets were filled with people going about their lives, completely unaware of the massive silent war unfolding within these corporate walls. I had spent 40 years building Caldwell Medical Solutions. I had sacrificed countless weekends, missed family holidays, and poured every ounce of my energy into creating a legacy that would provide for my family long after I was gone. I had given Preston everything a son could possibly desire. I had funded his elite education, paid for his luxury vehicles, and handed him a prestigious executive title within my own empire. But instead of gratitude, my generosity had bred a toxic, insatiable entitlement. He looked at my life's work and saw only a carcass to be scavenged. He did not just want to build his own success, he wanted to entirely consume mine. He had actively partnered with ruthless corporate raiders to dismantle his father's company from the inside out. He had used the sacred concept of a marriage celebration to mask the greatest intellectual property theft in the history of our industry. And he had used my own checking account to pay for the venue, the food, and the drinks. The ultimate truth was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. My son was not misguided. He was not just confused by ambition. He was a highly organized corporate terrorist who had declared a sudden, absolute, and unforgiving war on his own father. Right before my very eyes, ensuring that our familial bond was permanently severed and completely destroyed without a single shred of lingering hesitation. I remained standing by the glass wall of my office as the afternoon sun began its slow descent over the Chicago skyline. The vibrant orange and purple hues of the sunset cast long, dramatic shadows across the mahogany furniture, signaling the end of the traditional work week. For the rest of the city, Friday evening meant a transition into relaxation and weekend celebrations. For me, it marked the beginning of a meticulously calculated counteroffensive. I turned away from the breathtaking view and walked back to the conference table where Jonathan and Victor were silently waiting. The sheer magnitude of Preston and Monica's betrayal had completely galvanized my resolve. There was no room left for sorrow. There was only the cold, unyielding necessity of completely neutralizing an existential threat to my company. I looked at Jonathan and instructed him to pull up the complete profiles of the top 10 individuals listed on that fraudulent wedding guest list. I wanted direct private phone numbers for every single senior venture capitalist and regional hospital chief executive officer who had RSVP'd to my son's illicit launch party. Victor immediately went to work cross-referencing our internal client databases with the guest registry. Within minutes, he had generated a highly secure encrypted digital dossier. This package contained the undeniable, irrefutable proof of Preston's corporate espionage. It included the date-stamped network logs showing the unauthorized extraction of our proprietary source code, the newly filed Delaware registration documents for Apex Medical Innovations, and the damning transcripts of the emails where Preston explicitly detailed his plan to steal our market share. I told Victor to queue these dossiers up for immediate transmission. They were not to be sent until I personally gave the verbal command during my phone calls. I wanted the recipients to hear the gravity of the situation directly from my mouth before they laid eyes on the catastrophic evidence. Jonathan handed me a printed sheet containing the 10 private phone numbers, reminding me to keep my tone strictly informational and legally precise. I did not need to scream, and I did not need to make emotional threats. The absolute truth backed by ironclad forensic data would be far more destructive than any display of anger. I picked up my phone, dialed the first number on the list, and placed the device on speakerphone. The first call was to Richard Sterling, the senior managing partner of the Silicon Valley venture capital firm that Preston had been illegally courting. The phone rang 3 times before Richard answered, his voice booming with the jovial, relaxed energy of a man anticipating a highly profitable weekend. He warmly greeted me, expressing his excitement for the upcoming wedding festivities and offering premature congratulations. I did not return his pleasantries. I maintained a voice that was perfectly smooth, entirely devoid of emotion, and chillingly direct. I informed Richard that the event scheduled for tomorrow afternoon was not a wedding reception, but a fraudulent corporate launch intended to facilitate the sale of stolen intellectual property. The jovial energy instantly vanished from his voice, replaced by a sharp, cautious silence. I explained that my son, Preston Caldwell, alongside Monica, had illegally extracted the core architectural algorithms of my flagship medical diagnostic software. I told him that any financial investment in their newly registered entity, Apex Medical Innovations, would be considered the knowing reception of stolen corporate assets. Richard attempted to interrupt, stammering about a potential misunderstanding and defending the integrity of his firm. I calmly cut him off and instructed Victor to hit send on the digital dossier. I told Richard to check his secure inbox. I waited in the quiet conference room as the seconds ticked by. I could hear the faint sound of his keyboard clicking through the speakerphone as he opened the encrypted file. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with every passing moment as the reality of his massive liability washed over him. When Richard finally spoke again, his tone was entirely different. It was the tight, measured voice of a man who realized he had just stepped onto a live landmine. He quietly thanked me for the crucial information and assured me that his firm would immediately sever all ties and communications with Preston. He understood perfectly that moving forward with the deal meant facing a catastrophic, decade-long federal lawsuit that would utterly decimate his fund. I ended the call without another word and immediately moved down the list to the next target. The subsequent calls to the hospital chief executive officers required a slightly different approach. These were not aggressive venture capitalists looking for a quick payout. These were my established, loyal clients, the fundamental backbone of Caldwell Medical Solutions. They had RSVP'd to the event out of respect for our long-standing professional relationship. I dialed the private number of Dr. Aris Thorne, the head of the largest medical network in the Midwest. When she answered, I spoke with a tone of deep professional regret. I apologized for intruding on her Friday evening, but I stressed that I was calling to protect her institution from a severe legal and operational liability. I revealed the true nature of tomorrow's gathering, explaining that the new software Preston intended to pitch was entirely composed of stolen proprietary code. I assured her that Caldwell Medical Solutions remained completely stable and that our official, legitimate software launch would proceed exactly as scheduled. I then had Victor send her the sanitized version of the dossier, providing just enough forensic proof to validate my claims without exposing our sensitive algorithms. Dr. Thorne was deeply appalled. She had trusted Preston as an extension of my leadership, and the revelation of his profound deceit thoroughly disgusted her. She immediately assured me that neither she nor any representative from her hospital network would be attending the fraudulent event. I repeated this exact process for the remaining 8 individuals on the list. I sat at the head of the conference table for 3 unbroken hours, systematically and ruthlessly dismantling the foundation of my son's stolen empire. With every quiet, methodical phone call, I severed another vital artery of his startup. I methodically stripped away his funding, his prospective clients, and his professional credibility. I did not raise my voice a single time. I simply laid out the cold, undeniable facts and let the immense weight of the federal legal system do the threatening for me. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the list was completely exhausted. I placed my phone face down on the mahogany table and let out a long, slow exhale. Tomorrow afternoon, Preston and Monica would arrive at the grand ballroom entirely expecting a space filled with eager investors and wealthy clients. They would be dressed in their finest attire, ready to deliver the pitch of a lifetime and secure their stolen fortune. Instead, they would find an empty room. The venture capitalists would not show up. The hospital executives would ignore their calls. The fraudulent launch party they had orchestrated using my money was guaranteed to be a completely spectacular failure. The financial assets were frozen. The penthouse doors were physically locked. The federal authorities were now building a massive criminal case. Saturday morning arrived with a quiet, undisturbed serenity that stood in stark contrast to the massive corporate war I had silently orchestrated the night before. I woke up at exactly 6 in the morning, guided only by my internal clock rather than an alarm. I walked down the stairs of my own home, the silence of the empty house offering a profound sense of peace. I moved into the kitchen and began my morning routine, meticulously grinding dark roast coffee beans and waiting for the water to reach the perfect temperature. I poured the black coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and carried it into my private study. The room was bathed in the soft, pale light of the early morning sun, filtering through the large bay windows. I sat down in my favorite leather reading chair and placed my smartphone face up on the polished wooden side table. Today was supposed to be the monumental day of my only son's wedding. It was supposed to be a day filled with tuxedo fittings, tearful toasts, and forced family photographs. Instead, it was the day the grand, malicious illusion they had built was scheduled to spectacularly shatter. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee and waited for the inevitable digital avalanche to begin. The first digital tremor occurred precisely at 8 in the morning. My phone screen suddenly illuminated with a bright, glaring notification. It was an automated alert from the central corporate banking security system, a protocol I had instructed Victor to temporarily route directly to my personal device for the weekend. A charge for $12,000 had just been aggressively declined. The vendor listed on the transaction was the elite floral design studio Monica had hired to construct her massive imported orchid walls and custom table centerpieces. Less than 2 minutes later, a second notification flashed across the screen. A massive charge for $40,000 from the premium coastal seafood catering company had hit a solid brick wall. The corporate credit cards that Preston had been casually using to fund his fraudulent launch party cards he mistakenly believed were securely linked to an untouchable executive expense account were completely dead. I watched the screen with a cold, detached fascination as a third, fourth, and fifth notification arrived in rapid succession. The classical string quartet, the luxury limousine service, and the premium champagne distributor were all simultaneously attempting to run their final balances on the morning of the event, and every single one of them was being met with absolute uncompromising rejection. The financial lifeline that had sustained their arrogant fantasy was now completely severed. I could easily picture the rising panic currently unfolding in the lobbies of those elite vendors. The event coordinators would be frantically dialing Preston's number, demanding immediate alternative payment methods before loading their delivery trucks. Preston, likely still wearing his expensive silk pajamas in whatever premium hotel suite they had retreated to after finding themselves locked out of the corporate penthouse, would be staring at his own phone in absolute horror. He would try his backup cards, his personal platinum accounts, and his hidden offshore routing numbers, only to discover that Victor had successfully frozen every single asset tied to his name and social security number. The massive, incredibly expensive, and completely fraudulent wedding reception was actively bleeding out before a single guest had even arrived. The vendors were ruthless business people who operated on strict payment protocols. Without the immediate clearance of those massive final invoices, the beautiful floral arrangements would stay in their refrigerated warehouses, the imported caviar would remain packed in ice, and the grand ballroom would sit entirely empty and completely devoid of any celebration. The financial collapse was only the first wave of the devastation. By 9 in the morning, the second, far more lethal phase of my retaliation began to manifest on my device. Alongside the declined transaction alerts, a steady stream of automated email forwarded notifications began to flood my inbox. These were the digital RSVPs linked to the master guest list. The personal phone calls I had made on Friday evening were now bearing their heavy, destructive fruit. The first cancellation came from Richard Sterling, the lead venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. His brief, terribly polite email formally withdrew his entire firm's attendance, citing a sudden, unavoidable conflict of interest. Within the next hour, a relentless cascade of identical cancellations followed. The aggressive private equity directors, the ambitious angel investors, and the wealthy technology speculators were withdrawing their presence en masse. They had all received my legally binding warning regarding the stolen intellectual property, and they were sprinting away from Preston's fraudulent startup as if it were a burning building. None of them wanted to be photographed in the same room as a man who was about to be federally indicted for massive corporate espionage. Then came the cancellations from my own loyal clients. Dr. Eris Thorne and the other chief executive officers of the major regional hospital networks sent formal, remarkably brief messages regretting their inability to attend. They had realized that the man they had trusted, the young executive they thought represented the bright future of Caldwell Medical Solutions, was actually attempting to sell them stolen goods. By 10:30 in the morning, almost every single highly anticipated corporate guest had formally and officially pulled completely out of the massive event. The intricate, highly calculated guest list that Monica had spent months meticulously curating had completely evaporated in the span of 3 short hours. The exclusive corporate launch party they had so cleverly disguised as a beautiful wedding reception was now a total, spectacular failure. They had planned to unveil their stolen software to a room full of powerful billionaires and industry giants. Now, if they managed to scrounge up enough pocket change to actually open the doors of the ballroom, they would be pitching their stolen algorithms to a few confused college friends and a handful of distant relatives who had no idea what was happening. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling an immense, profound satisfaction wash over me. The house of cards they had built was completely collapsing under the crushing weight of reality. They had vastly underestimated the sheer power and absolute resolve of the man they had tried to casually discard. They thought my money made them untouchable, but they failed to realize that the hand that writes the check can always tear it up. The grand illusion was totally shattered, leaving them with nothing but the ugly, terrifying truth. I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, watching the notifications constantly flash across the screen. I did not feel any pity for the frantic desperation they were undoubtedly experiencing right now. They intentionally tried to steal my legacy and leave me in ruins. They brought this catastrophic devastation entirely upon themselves. I slowly placed the heavy ceramic mug down on the wooden table and smiled into the silent, sunlit room. The ultimate corporate execution they had planned for me had been completely reversed. I was going to enjoy every single moment of their absolute downfall as they realized the game was completely, permanently over. My phone remained silent for precisely 12 more minutes before the screen violently flared to life. The display projected Preston's name across the quiet expanse of my study. I did not move to answer it. I remained seated in my leather chair, resting the ceramic mug against my knee, and watched the device vibrate across the polished table. The frantic energy radiating from the screen painted a vivid picture of the absolute chaos currently unfolding in the grand lobby of the Ritz-Carlton. I knew exactly what was happening miles away in downtown Chicago. At this precise moment, the highly professional banquet manager of the hotel was standing in front of my son, firmly demanding a valid form of payment before a single chair was placed in the ballroom. The initial corporate card Preston had confidently placed on file yesterday had been rejected by the automated merchant system. I could effortlessly imagine the scene. Preston, dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo trousers and a crisp white shirt, would be feigning mild annoyance. He would smoothly assure the hotel staff that it was merely a temporary security hold, a common inconvenience when dealing with massive expense accounts. He would pull out his metal black card with a practiced flourish, expecting the problem to disappear with a simple swipe. But the terminal would flash red again. Denied. The polite smile on the banquet manager's face would begin to strain, shifting from hospitality to cold, transactional reality. A hotel of that caliber does not operate on promises or the implied wealth of an arrogant groom. They require liquid capital. When the second card failed, the mild annoyance on Preston's face would morph into genuine creeping confusion. He would pull out his personal platinum cards, the ones tied directly to his executive salary and his generous trust fund. He would hand them over one by one, each swipe resulting in the exact same humiliating rejection. Insufficient funds. Account frozen. Contact your financial institution. The words would hit him like physical blows. Monica, standing nearby in her silk bridal robe, would undoubtedly step forward to offer her own premium credit cards. She would try to project an aura of calm control, assuring the vendors that this was simply a ridiculous banking error that would be rectified on Monday morning. But Victor had been incredibly thorough. Her accounts, deeply entangled with the fraudulent Delaware corporation they had just registered, were entirely frozen under the newly initiated federal fraud investigation. Her cards would bounce just as violently as his. The reality of their situation would crash down upon them in the middle of that opulent lobby. The massive, beautiful floral arrangements, the imported white orchids, and the elaborate table centerpieces that were currently waiting on loading docks would remain exactly where they were. The catering staff, who were scheduled to begin prepping the premium seafood and carving the expensive cuts of beef, would immediately stand down. The jazz band would not unpack their instruments. The entire machinery of their lavish, stolen corporate launch party would grind to an absolute, uncompromising halt. Without my money to grease the wheels, their grand vision was nothing more than an empty, silent room. They were facing 300 empty chairs and a massive bill they had absolutely no way of paying. The realization that this was not a banking error would suddenly dawn on Preston. He would realize that a simultaneous catastrophic failure of every single corporate and personal account could only be orchestrated by one person. He would know with absolute certainty that his father had finally cut the strings. That is why my phone was currently vibrating off the edge of my desk. The screen went dark as the first call rolled over to the automated voicemail system. 10 seconds later, it lit up again. Preston was dialing repeatedly, entirely consumed by a desperate, suffocating panic. The man who had coldly calculated my corporate demise, the man who had laughed at me and called me an obsolete cash cow just a few days prior, was now frantically begging for my attention. I lifted the coffee mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was robust and perfectly hot. I felt a profound, settling peace wash over my entire body. It was the quiet, steady calm of a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous storm and emerged completely victorious on the other side. For decades, I had answered every single call my son had ever made. I had rushed to fix his problems, smooth over his mistakes, and finance his ambitions. I had always been his ultimate safety net. But the social contract between us was irrevocably broken. I was no longer his father, and I was certainly no longer his savior. I was simply the chief executive officer of Caldwell Medical Solutions, and I do not take calls from corporate terrorists. The phone stopped ringing and instantly chimed with a new voicemail notification. I reached out, tapped the screen, and placed the audio on speaker. Preston's voice filled the quiet study, breathless and pitched high with thinly veiled hysteria. He was speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to construct a plausible lie. He told me there was a massive issue with the bank. He said the hotel was threatening to cancel the entire reception if they did not receive a wire transfer within the next 20 minutes. He begged me to answer the phone, claiming it was an absolute emergency that would ruin the wedding. He did not mention the investors. He did not mention the stolen software. He was still desperately clinging to the false narrative of the injured groom, hoping my paternal instincts would blindly override any logical hesitation. I listened to the entire message without moving a single muscle. The desperation in his tone was palpable, a stark contrast to the arrogant confidence he had displayed in those decrypted offshore emails. When the message ended, the phone immediately began to ring again. He was relentless. He was backed into a corner watching his entire fraudulent empire dissolve before his eyes, and he had nowhere else to turn. Monica's name appeared on the caller identification screen next. She was trying to reach me from her own device, likely hoping that a tearful plea from the distressed bride would somehow penetrate my defenses. I watched her name flash on the screen, feeling nothing but disgust for the woman who happily plotted my destruction. I let her call go to voicemail as well. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of an argument. I was not going to engage in a screaming match or listen to fabricated excuses. Silence is often the most devastating weapon a man can deploy. By refusing to answer, I was sending a message more powerful than any threat I could vocalize. I was telling them they were completely cut off. I was telling them that I knew exactly what they had done and that the protective walls of my empire were permanently closed to them. They were entirely on their own, completely exposed to the cold, harsh reality they had created. The digital display on my phone eventually went dark, the relentless vibrating finally ceasing as the automated voicemail system reached its maximum capacity. I left the device sitting on the polished mahogany table and leaned back in my chair, allowing the profound silence of my study to envelop me completely. The morning slowly bled into the early afternoon, the warm sunlight shifting across the Persian rug. I spent those quiet hours reviewing the final legal dossiers Jonathan had prepared, ensuring every single piece of forensic evidence was perfectly aligned for the federal prosecutors. The trap was set, the walls were fortified, and the only thing left was the inevitable explosive collision. I did not have to wait much longer. Precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy, tranquil silence of my estate was violently shattered. The harsh, aggressive sound of tires skidding across the loose gravel of my long, private driveway echoed through the open windows. I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, and walked deliberately toward the grand foyer. Heavy car doors slammed shut with tremendous force, followed instantly by the rapid, frantic clicking of high heels and the heavy thud of leather dress shoes charging up the front stone steps. Before I could even reach the entryway, a thunderous, continuous pounding began to assault my solid oak front doors. The heavy brass knocker was being slammed against the wood with a desperate, unhinged ferocity. Through the thick oak, I could hear Preston's voice, no longer breathless or pleading, but entirely consumed by a raw, unrestrained panic. He was screaming for me to open the door, demanding immediate answers, his words cracking under the immense pressure of his collapsing world. I took a deep, centering breath, fully embracing the cold, calculated detachment of a chief executive officer facing a hostile threat. I reached out, turned the heavy deadbolt, and pulled the grand doors open. The sight before me was a vivid, pathetic portrait of ruined ambition. Preston stood on my porch, his breathing ragged and uneven. He was wearing his custom-tailored wedding tuxedo, but the crisp elegance of the garment was entirely destroyed. His bow tie was completely undone, hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar, and his tailored jacket was hopelessly wrinkled. Beside him stood Monica, wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive white silk bridal gown. But there was absolutely nothing joyous or celebratory about her appearance. Her face was flushed with pure, unadulterated rage, her jaw tightly clenched, and her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. Preston immediately lunged forward, stopping just short of the threshold, his hands trembling violently. He demanded to know what I had done. He screamed that every single corporate and personal account was completely frozen. He frantically explained that the banquet manager at the Ritz-Carlton had publicly humiliated them, physically blocking them from entering the grand ballroom because the catering and floral invoices had instantly bounced. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, attempting to play the role of the confused, victimized son one final pathetic time. He desperately asked if there had been a massive, catastrophic banking error, practically begging me to pull out my personal checkbook and fix the situation before their guests arrived. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply stood in the doorway of my home, looking at my flesh and blood with an expression of absolute freezing indifference. I did not offer a single word of comfort, Nor did I provide the easy, convenient excuse he was so desperately searching for. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch between us, forcing him to drown in the absolute reality of his own making. The silence proved too much for Monica to bear. The carefully constructed facade of the fragile, socially anxious bride. The delicate act she had maintained for over a year to manipulate my family completely vanished in an instant. She violently pushed past Preston, stepping aggressively into my personal space. Her face contorted into a vicious, snarling mask of pure malice. She jabbed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute venom. She completely dropped the fake, respectful tone she had always used in my presence. She screamed that I was a senile, obsolete old fool who was actively ruining the most important business deal of their lives. In her blind, unrestrained fury, she completely abandoned the wedding narrative. She demanded that I unlock the corporate accounts immediately. She shrieked that her most vital venture capital investors were already waiting downtown, that the entire launch of their startup was hanging by a thread, and that my petty, pathetic jealousy over being uninvited to a party was destroying a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She stood on my front porch, wearing a white bridal gown, purchased with my money, openly screaming about the corporate assassination she had meticulously planned against me. I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of vindication. Every single horrible word I had read in those decrypted chat logs was now standing right in front of me, screaming its absolute truth into the afternoon air. I slowly raised my hand, silencing her frantic shrieking with a single authoritative gesture. I looked directly into Monica's furious eyes, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal whisper. I told her that there would be no launch party for Apex Medical Innovations today, tomorrow, or ever. I told her that the proprietary medical algorithms she had illegally downloaded from my secure servers were currently safely back under my exclusive control. I informed her that the newly minted Delaware Limited Liability Company she had so cleverly registered last week was already the primary target of a massive, devastating federal cybercrime investigation. I watched the blood instantly drain from Monica's flushed face. The vicious, screaming corporate raider vanished, instantly replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing as her mind desperately tried to comprehend how I knew every single intimate detail of her hidden, fraudulent empire. Preston looked as though the ground had literally vanished from beneath his feet. His knees buckled slightly, and he leaned heavily against the stone pillar of the porch for physical support. He stared at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming horror, as he finally understood the true magnitude of my retaliation. He stammered, his voice barely a whisper, asking how I could possibly know those names. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, bringing the full crushing weight of my authority directly down upon his shoulders. I told him that I knew everything. I told him I had read every single deleted email, every hidden chat log, and every encrypted venture capital proposal. I informed him that I had spent my entire Friday evening personally calling Richard Sterling and the chief executive officers of the regional hospital networks he had so arrogantly invited. I told him that I had provided them with undeniable, ironclad forensic proof that the software they were promised was entirely stolen corporate property. I watched his soul completely shatter, realizing the brilliant, flawless coup he had executed was finally destroyed forever, starting right here today. I stepped slowly back, pulling the heavy oak doors wide open to reveal the men who had been waiting silently in the dark shadows of the grand foyer. Jonathan Reed, my trusted senior legal counsel, stepped forward onto the stone porch, his face a perfectly blank mask of professional detachment. He was immediately flanked by two extremely large, physically imposing men dressed in immaculate dark suits. These were private security contractors I had retained early that morning, highly trained specialists in handling hostile corporate extractions and high-risk asset protection. Preston physically recoiled in shock, his eyes darting frantically between the broad, formidable shoulders of the security personnel and the icy, unyielding stare of my attorney. Monica instinctively reached down and grabbed her torn silk bridal gown, pulling the expensive fabric tightly against her chest, as if it could somehow magically shield her from the impending devastation. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single ounce of lingering paternal warmth to soften the absolute severity of my words. I reached out and took the thick, heavy manila folder from Jonathan. I held it up in the air for a brief, agonizing second, letting them clearly recognize the embossed crest of Caldwell Medical Solutions proudly printed on the cover. Then, with a slow, deliberate, dismissive flick of my wrist, I dropped it. The heavy folder hit the stone porch right at Preston's polished leather shoes with a resounding smack. The harsh impact broke the wax seal, sending a magnificent, damning cascade of printed documents spilling across the gray slate tiles. I told him to look very closely at the paperwork currently decorating my front steps. I patiently explained that those highly sensitive pages contained the complete unredacted network server logs, definitively identifying his unauthorized late-night data extractions. I pointed a steady finger to the highly classified financial documents detailing the complicated offshore banking channels he had so clumsily attempted to use to hide his initial seed capital. I explicitly highlighted the comprehensive technical analysis reports that conclusively matched the core algorithms of Apex Medical Innovations to the proprietary source code meticulously developed by my brilliant engineering team. I watched as Preston's gaze fell upon the scattered evidence, his shoulders completely slumping in total, unmitigated defeat. He could not argue. He could not fabricate another desperate, convoluted excuse to save himself. The absolute, unvarnished truth was lying right at his feet, undeniably stark and legally lethal. Monica stared at the scattered documents, her sharp, shallow breathing echoing loudly in the quiet afternoon air. I turned my attention directly to her, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, icy pitch. I told her that the elaborate, highly manipulative performance she had orchestrated was officially over. I methodically dismantled the pathetic, insulting narrative she had used to intentionally isolate me, exposing the calculated, vicious reality behind her sudden panic attacks and her supposed fear of my overbearing expectations. I explicitly informed her that I knew exactly how she had eagerly weaponized my paternal generosity to entirely fund her malicious corporate takeover. She had completely abandoned the theatrical act of the fragile, overwhelmed bride, but now stripped entirely of her arrogant confidence, she looked completely small, pathetic, and terrified. She frantically tried to open her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a desperate, hollow apology or invent a brand new emotional manipulation, but no sound came out of her throat. She was finally suffocating under the crushing weight of her own profound arrogance and insatiable greed. I shifted my focus back to my son, the man who had traded his loyal family for a stolen fortune. I delivered the final crushing blows with absolute surgical precision. I told Preston that his employment at Caldwell Medical Solutions was terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, corporate espionage, and the brazen theft of intellectual property. He was permanently barred from entering any company facility, accessing any corporate network, or communicating with any active employee. Jonathan stepped forward, producing a crisp, legally binding document from his leather briefcase, and handed it directly to Preston. I explained that this was a formal 24-hour eviction notice for the luxury penthouse they currently occupied. I reminded him that the premium property was an exclusive corporate asset completely owned and entirely maintained by the company. Since he was no longer an executive, he no longer had the privilege of sleeping under my roof. They had exactly until tomorrow afternoon to remove their personal belongings, operating under the strict, continuous supervision of my private security team. Whatever they decided to leave behind would be unceremoniously discarded into the public street. Preston's hands shook violently as he hesitantly took the eviction notice, his eyes rapidly welling with thick, hot tears of profound, inescapable panic. He stammered pitifully, begging for a single chance to make things right, desperately pleading for a tiny fraction of the endless mercy I had consistently shown him his entire privileged life. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a vast, cold, empty void, where my deep paternal affection used to comfortably reside. I bluntly told him that every single potential investor, every elite venture capitalist, and every regional hospital executive on his highly curated fraudulent guest list had been thoroughly and personally briefed on his severe criminal activities. I informed him that Richard Sterling had personally assured me over the phone that his prestigious, well-funded firm would never touch their toxic, fraudulent startup. I made it absolutely, undeniably clear that Apex Medical Innovations was entirely dead before it ever had the chance to take a single breath, and that the federal authorities were already aggressively reviewing the massive pile of forensic evidence currently scattered on the porch. The luxurious free ride was permanently over, and the incredibly wealthy, sheltered reality he had arrogantly taken for granted his entire life was completely destroyed. I personally delivered the final devastating consequence with absolute clarity, ensuring there was absolutely zero room for any possible misinterpretation. I informed Preston that Jonathan had already initiated the necessary legal protocols to completely sever him from my personal estate. The massive generational wealth he had so arrogantly assumed would always be waiting to catch him had been entirely redirected. I explained that the sprawling, historic Montana estate, the magnificent property he had always coveted as his future summer retreat, along with the vast majority of my liquid assets, were being formally transferred into a permanent, irrevocable trust. This immense trust would directly fund a prominent children's hospital, providing critical resources and life-saving treatments for those who actually needed and truly deserved profound financial support. I told him that he had looked at my entire life's work and seen only an opportunity for ruthless theft. Therefore, he would not receive a single remaining cent of my fortune. I instructed the security contractors to escort them off my private property immediately and to forcefully arrest them for trespassing if they ever dared to return. I finally turned my back on my treacherous son, walked slowly into the quiet sanctuary of my home, and pulled the massive, heavy oak doors firmly shut, the solid, resonant thud echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality. 6 months have passed since that turbulent Saturday afternoon. The harsh, biting winter winds that once whipped through the streets of Chicago have finally given way to the gentle, warming embrace of spring. The seasonal shift outside perfectly mirrors the profound transformation that has taken place within the walls of Caldwell Medical Solutions. My company did not simply survive the attempted corporate sabotage, it actively thrived in the aftermath. With the toxic elements permanently excised from our network, my dedicated team of engineers worked with an unprecedented level of creative freedom and rigorous focus. Last month, we officially launched our revolutionary diagnostic software to the medical market. The industry response was overwhelmingly positive, exceeding even our most optimistic internal projections. I stood on the main stage at the National Healthcare Technology Convention, proudly looking out at a massive audience filled with the very hospital executives Preston had so foolishly attempted to manipulate. When the presentation concluded, the room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. I did not stand alone under those bright stage lights. I was flanked by my lead developers, my loyal project managers, and the hardworking men and women who had actually poured their sweat and intellect into creating the platform. They were the ones who truly earned their place beside me. Meanwhile, the reality facing Preston and Monica presents a stark, unforgiving contrast to my continued success. Their arrogant dream of a corporate empire completely collapsed before it ever took a single breath. The federal authorities moved with swift, merciless precision. The Cybercrime Division completely seized every digital asset connected to Apex Medical Innovations, dismantling their fraudulent shell company piece by piece. Preston and Monica are currently facing a mountain of severe federal indictments for grand corporate espionage, unauthorized data extraction, and massive intellectual property theft. Their high-priced defense attorneys demanded exorbitant retainers upfront, rapidly draining whatever meager personal savings they had left. Without my financial umbrella to shield them from the consequences of their actions, their lavish lifestyle instantly evaporated. They were unceremoniously evicted from the corporate penthouse, precisely 24 hours after our final confrontation on my front porch. Today, they live in a cramped, poorly lit rental apartment located in a highly undesirable industrial suburb. Monica was forced to sell her expensive engagement ring and designer wardrobe just to afford their basic monthly utility bills. The luxurious European vacations, the exclusive country club memberships, and the imported champagne are nothing more than distant, bitter memories. They are entirely isolated, completely cut off from the powerful social circles they once so arrogantly dominated. The influential venture capitalists and wealthy investors they tried to deceive blacklisted them immediately, ensuring they will never work in the technology or medical sectors ever again. Preston has reportedly taken a low-level administrative position just to keep their heads barely above water while they wait for their impending criminal trial. They spend their long, quiet evenings violently blaming each other for the massive failure, watching their toxic marriage crumble into dust. I do not monitor their daily misery, nor do I actively celebrate their profound downfall. I simply observe their situation as a necessary, unavoidable consequence of their own malicious greed. The absolute finality of our separation has brought me an immense settling peace. I sleep soundly every single night, free from the constant exhausting burden of funding their insatiable entitlement. My wealth is no longer a weapon used against me. It is a tool I use to foster genuine progress and reward true loyalty. The legal transfer of my vast personal estate was finalized 3 months ago. The sprawling Montana property, along with the overwhelming majority of my private financial assets, now formally belongs to the Irrevocable Philanthropic Trust. When I toured the newly funded wing of the Children's Hospital last week, a young, exhausted mother approached me in the hallway. She held my hand, her eyes welling with tears of profound gratitude, and thanked me for providing the life-saving medical treatments her daughter desperately needed. In that quiet, powerful moment, I looked at her tired, genuine smile and realized the absolute truth about what a man leaves behind when his time on earth concludes. True legacy is never determined by a simple biological connection. It is not measured by the names printed on a birth certificate or the familial titles we blindly inherit. True legacy is built entirely upon a foundation of unwavering integrity, mutual respect, and the positive impact we leave on the world. I had spent decades wrongly believing that my son was my ultimate legacy, foolishly pouring my resources into a hollow vessel. Now, standing among loyal colleagues and witnessing the genuine healing my wealth provides, my eyes are finally open. The free ride is permanently over, but my real life has just begun. Blood may make you related, but loyalty, respect, and integrity are what make you family. Never allow the title of parent to become synonymous with victim. When the people you have sacrificed your entire life for begin to view your generosity as a weakness to be exploited, you must have the courage to close your wallet and open your eyes. Real love sets boundaries. Walking away from toxic, manipulative family members is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate action of total self-respect. You simply cannot ever buy gratitude, and you should never fund your own disrespect. Greed often hides behind the most convincing masks. If you have ever had to make the painful decision to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your legacy, share your story in the comments. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Stay strong.